Greetings, groovy people! Welcome to Blue Dragon Art, where I discuss comics and comic making, art, indie comics, my free not safe for work post-apocalyptic magical girl fantasy dark horse! Whoa. The links are down in the description. Well, if anyone was watching this video, I'm sure after that intro, they have clicked off of it. Anyway, links are down in the description for my comic. This week's topic of discussion is A. Dark horse, B. Indie comic art, C. Random art topic that's months behind being topical anymore, D. Art books, or E. Collabs and other projects. Survey says, stop making game show reference. Oh my god. Well, the answer is D. Topic is art books. This is going to be a long video, y'all. So, I mean, I don't need to tell anyone. I know that most people have probably already clicked off, and that's fine. That's fine. I'm boring, number one. But also, this is a pretty niche topic as it's a review of a how-to book. And, you know, I will be trying to be interesting and trying to, make the video, the elements in the background interesting. I'm going to be doing some kind of drawing. This is actually a video that I've done a lot of research for, believe it or not. Usually I just kind of just shit my videos out. No, usually my videos, they might take work, but they don't usually take this much work. But I read this book over maybe about a month or two. I had to check it out 3 times. Because I'm a slow reader and I was taking notes. So yeah, this is going to be a very long video and it's going to be kind of a niche topic. But if you're open to hearing me discuss this, we're going to be talking about Hirohiko Araki's book, Manga in Theory and Practice, The Craft of Creating Manga. So that's the topic. And normally I just kind of do a skim and, review and opinions. But this is going to be a very in-depth discussion because I felt like it. I wanted to share this with people. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start at the beginning, actually. Somewhere along the line, I came across somebody talking about how Hirohiko Araki actually wrote a book on how to do manga. And in addition to this, they linked to the internetarchive.org website, which showed that the book was actually, as of now, free of charge for you to enjoy. It's maybe 200 some odd pages in length. So I checked out the link, which I shall share with all of you out there. It's going to be down in the description. And to say the very least, I was intrigued because if you know me, if you've been around the channel, or even if you haven't been around the channel, I will tell you that even though I am an independent artist and I don't particularly ever feel like being hugely professional, I mean, I know that even if I strived, I would never reach, a huge popularity level. That's fine. I'm happy with that. It doesn't mean that I'm not someone who wants to improve on my comic crafting, at least to satisfy myself and hopefully satisfy other people who read. I do care about my readers, don't get me wrong, I'll talk more about that in depth later on. But I want to improve for the sake of myself, improving in my own eyes. So I have read things like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. I've read several books by Mark Curley. This book here, definitely intrigued me, and I decided that I was going to check it out from my local library. So at the time of recording, I just finished this book, and I wanted to talk about it while everything was still fresh in my memory. I took notes on this. I read it fairly carefully, but even so, as with any book, especially if you're wanting to learn from it, it's probably going to take 1 or 2 read-throughs, and maybe even keep it as a reference. But I digress. Let's go ahead and start the video by going into a tiny bit of history, because some of you out there, you may be wondering who in the flying fuck is Hirohiko Araki, and why should I care about this how to draw a manga book? If you've seen JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, you probably already know that Araki is the mangaka who came up with the series for Shonen Jump back in the 80s, and that it is a series that is still running. It's come such a long way. It's had a lot of evolutions, and right now it's still JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but it's actually kind of like JoJo Lands or something like that. And he switched from Shonen Jump to I think a seinen manga magazine because, and don't quote me on this, I was watching a video where someone was talking about it, so this could just be hearsay, but I thought Araki had said about how he wanted to have more time to work on his pages because the publication had a less rigorous schedule than something like Shonen Jump. I'm just gonna keep that very vague because I don't read Shonen Jump, so I'm not gonna say shit. I'm not even gonna guess because I don't know. But, you know, even if you're not a fan of the show, maybe you've never watched it on Netflix, maybe you never watched it anywhere else, even if you're not a fan of the show, it's really hard to not run into memes or other popular medium that has been influenced by this freaking monster of a comic series. It is huge, and it had a massive impact not only on Japan, but even more recently directly on us in the West, and even before the US finally discovered it. And aside from people who were aware of the 90s OVA of Stardust Crusaders that came out, which I watched. First part was not very enjoyable, but I sat there. The second part, it looked like they switched up the animators, and they definitely leaned more into the comedic elements of the manga, which I personally enjoyed more. But I'm sorry, I like the new iteration of it better than the OVA. I'm not gonna shit on the OVA, but I mean, it's free to watch online if anyone wants to check it out. If you like old school 90s anime, you're gonna like this probably. But anyway, I digress. It's just had such a huge cultural impact that you might see weird ass bumper stickers written in katakana that say like go 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 or do 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 do, because that's like kind of iconic, like the way he writes the sound effects in the comic. That's how fucking iconic JoJo's is, that it can be symbolized by a fucking manga sound effect font that is just used throughout the comic over and over again. But even if you weren't walking around the hard streets of Portland and saw somebody with a fucking JoJo's bumper sticker, you know, you might have found, maybe you're listening to your favorite Yes song, or you've been a Prince fan for fucking decades, and you go to the Gold Experience and it's just full of all these fucking weeaboos talking, oh my god, I loved it when this happened in Golden Wind and blah 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 blah. Or you're, yes, oh, this band is so great. And it's like, dude, I've been listening to this already for years. You might have had that phenomenon happen. I feel like, you know, you may have ran into the JoJo's fandom even if you never ran into JoJo's itself. Or maybe you are a 90s and 80s and 90s kid. I'm saying 90s kid now. I was born in like the mid 80s, so I kind of have like the best of both worlds and the worst of both worlds. Anyway, we won't get into that. But moving along, maybe you grew up in the 90s and you played Street Fighter, where Colonel Guile is essentially the love child of von Stroheim and Polnareff, two different characters that are in the JoJo series. And this specific character does Wamu, another character's divine sandstorm attack. Even if you don't know JoJo's, you probably have come across something in like video games or manga or even Western comics now. I mean, and even me, like, hell, I didn't even fucking realize it. I have been a massive fan, like an absolute, like my absolute favorite mangaka super team, Clamp, has been my absolute favorite. And aside from Sailor Moon, it's Clamp who really fucking got me into being a weeaboo. Okay, I'm not a weeaboo. I'm more of an otaku. I don't go around, like, I try to learn about the culture in addition to enjoying the anime and the manga. But Clamp had the JoJo Stardust Crusaders in one of their Clamp and Wonderland specials, which is just kind of like paying homage and like celebrating the success of a lot of their works, because they are super big in Japan, or at least they were. And I'm sure some of you out there, if you like, no matter what genre it is you like, you've probably stumbled upon Clamp somewhere, whether it be Tokyo Babylon. For me it was Rigveda, and definitely XXX Holic. I love the shit out of that. I was actually reading Clover. I love Clover. But like, they do so many different genres. They do the magical girl genre with like Cardcaptor Sakura. They do like the fantasy epic with Rigveda, which is inspired by a lot of Indian theology, although it's obviously interpreted through their lens in a completely different story, obviously. But they also do like action, and like their artwork really had an influence on manga and anime as like a whole. So even Clamp, they got their start apparently as, I knew they did doujin of like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, you know? I learned something new from doing this video. Just, God. I just stumbled across that shit. And now that I actually grabbed my Northside book, I have an art book of theirs. I'm gonna go ahead and flash up copies of that book. You can see there's Jota, who is the creation of the Clamp team and is the child of the married Jotaro and Kyokyoin. And apparently Jota, who is in these images, hatched out of an egg that Kyokyoin laid. So if you thought JoJo's couldn't get any more bizarre, you clearly didn't filter it through Clamp. So, yeah, lay off the fanfiction artists, because you never know. Some of them may end up becoming phenomenal authors and comicers. Often, though, if you're just watching some random anime or playing some random video game, again, even if it's Japanese-based or now Western animation, you might see characters strike a very impossibly ridiculous pose. I'm not saying they're all referencing JoJo's, but a good number of them probably are. No Game, No Life apparently has a ton of references to JoJo's. Oh, anyway, a lot of anime and manga has obviously been influenced by Araki's seminal series. And while it might not be everybody's cup of tea, even if you don't like it, which is fine. I don't judge people. I get it's not for everyone. But even if you don't like it, there's absolutely no denying its influence in pop culture, both overseas, here in the US, and just abroad. So, if you couldn't tell, I am personally a pretty big fan. I haven't been able to read all of the manga, but I've slowly been getting it. I gotta say, there's a reason why the series became so popular. You can nitpick about it being all exposition. There's a ton of exposition. There's exposition for the exposition, but, you can get annoyed at that, and that the characters and all the tropes, many of which these tropes, they are the ones who actually created the tropes, the comic did. And you can just not like big beefy dudes dressed in fashion inspired by the runway and music, but again, I gotta stress, this dude clearly tapped into something, and he has an idea of what is needed to write for generations, literally generation spanning manga series. Not just within the comic itself, but something that generations of people have been growing up with. So it's kind of multi-layered. All of that is to say that this book was written by not only a popular mangaka, but a literal cultural icon. Someone who knows what the fuck he's doing, in other words. So I figured he might have some insight on how to write comics, maybe. I mean, who am I to judge without reading the words? So, since the book was free and it was translated into a language I could read, I didn't have anything to lose except for some time. I checked to see if my local library carried it, which they did. I checked it out, and I embarked on my not-so-epic journey down what Araki calls the Royal Road. Okay, so what is this book? Okay, I need to finally get into this. Look, I needed an intro, and I'm passionate. I really fucking enjoyed this shit. I enjoy JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and rather than making something that I think everybody else has done over and over again, I wanted to keep this pertinent to my channel and what I personally like to talk about. I do like to gush about stuff, but this I figured would be maybe a little bit more helpful for people who are trying to make comics. So that's why I wanted to. So, manga in theory and practice, what the fuck is it? It's essentially a guide for writing stories in a similar vein as Araki and other authors, specifically focusing on shonen, in other words, like teen and tweens, that boy demographic of teenagers. It's more than that, though, because it's essentially a It's essentially a breakdown of one way that has been very successful to write a long-lasting, or even a short one-shot, comic. Let's start with just an overarching, is it accessible, okay? And I think it was very well translated. It's easy to read, but the sentence structure is eloquent. There are times when the translator used technical terms or, I don't know how to say this, like higher vocabulary terms. Like, the book didn't talk down to you. There were times when even I have a pretty firm grasp of of different diction and, you know, synonyms and shit like that. I like to go to freerice.com and work on my vocabulary every now and then. But there is within the text references to not only Japanese terminology like ki, sho, ten, ketsu, which I'll go into, but there's also stuff like, I'm gonna mispronounce this one, Tamo-roma? Thamo? It's T-H-E-A-E. The ligature for A-E, space R-O-M-A-E. I don't know what that's called, y'all. I'm a fucking idiot, okay? Leave me alone. Leave me alone. But, you know, a word that stands out, I'm so sorry, is peon, not peon. He specifically, towards the end of the book, talks about the concept of a peon to humanity. I had to look up that word. I had to look up the definition of that word. But for the most part, it's pretty accessible. But that's kind of what I mean, where the book is easy to read, but it might present you with words that you don't know, or maybe you're not familiar with. At least I wasn't familiar with some of the terminology. But don't worry, it's Araki. He's got you. If he uses a word that you don't know, he's gonna fucking follow it up with an explanation of what it is. Or you can look it up online, which is what I did, which is something that, you know, I was taught to do in class anyway. If you don't know something, look it up. Even if you think you know something, you might want to look it up if you're reading poetry, because they might be playing with the word with an older usage or meaning or something like that. So it's always good to learn new things, right? So Araki chose to cover the topic of manga writing within the confines of 7 chapters. There's an opening introduction. There's 2 example sections, one that's for long-form manga, and the other example he gives is for writing one-shots, short-form stories, and then the book has a conclusion. The intro itself gives us a peek into why Araki decided that he wanted to write the book. It had to do, spoilers, it had to do with a good friend of his that was his editor. I guess his editor was retiring, and this was in part an homage to him, though he doesn't get into that until later in the book. But what he does in the introduction is he sets out what his goals are with this and what you can expect, as well as how these concepts are applicable to storytelling outside of the realm of comics. Araki, y'all, is a huge fan of film and art and fashion and literature. A lot of that he's a fan of when it comes to like Western culture. I don't think it's any surprise if you know anything about JoJo's, if you know anything about the author, he loves the shit out of the spaghetti Westerns. I hope that's not a politically incorrect term, you guys. That's probably insensitive. I should probably cut it out, but I want someone to yell at me and tell me it's insensitive. Okay. If it's not, then cool. If it is, I'm sorry. I love you all in Italy. You're awesome. And your films are fucking awesome. You do great. You do great work. You got Fellini, for fuck's sake. Okay, you don't need me to say anything. Okay, but he often references cultural influences like that found in American or French filmmakers. Francis Truffaut, no less. I mean, that's actually one of my... I wouldn't say he's my favorite, but I will say I went through a little mini obsessive period where I had to watch all the Antoine Doinel.
Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel, Antoine Doinel.
If you haven't seen the 400 Blows, at the very least, you should watch that and or Stolen Kisses. I highly recommend them, and I'm pretty sure both of them are in the Criterion Collection. Not to say that means you have to like it, but I found them to be very enjoyable. But maybe this is a little bit topical. It's just kind of a side note that I wanted to get out here. I think Araki's interest in Western culture may be in part why a lot of Westerners finally caught on to JoJo's. And this is just my speculation. But much of the manga and animation contains characters that, for those who have trouble identifying with people who aren't their nationality, which is a thing. It's why we got Perry Mason just fucking shoehorned into the original Godzilla release here in the US. We didn't need no Perry Mason. I like Perry Mason, but we didn't need him in there. But, you know, I get that, like, people like to see themselves reflected in something. To get to my point, I think these are a little more accessible to Westerners than perhaps some manga series that take place in Japan and rely heavily upon a shared cultural experience and, references to etiquette and locations and habits that, unless you're a weeaboo or an otaku, that you may not understand or relate to until you immerse yourself in that culture. I also think that's the reason why a lot of people have trouble enjoying foreign films in general, even though there's clearly overarching universal concepts and themes that all of us as human beings can relate to. At the same time, I understand that it is difficult for some people to be able to kind of see themselves in a different culture, if that makes sense. So I'm not talking shit, but I'm sliding down like this theory, this idea that came to me as I was reading and writing the script. This dude has within his comic characters who are from England, Japan, the USA, Egypt, Italy, France, Mexico, all over the damn place. He has somebody, like, he has, like, a lot of diversity of cast, and they're not always just side characters. Yeah, you can look at someone like Smokey Brown and say, he was a side character. He really didn't play a very big part in the series. But then you've got someone like Avdol, who, like, is a major player, and even though he's not the primary hero, he's a really fucking kick-ass character. And even me, I don't always have too much problem, like, identifying with or living through an adventure through the male experience, just probably because that's kind of what my generation, we got female heroines, but you were for a while kind of expected that's what you lived through. I can do that, but at the same time, I'm not gonna lie, I was fucking excited when I saw Lisa. I was excited when I saw Jolene, being like the main character. Not so much fucking what's her name from Golden Wind. I mean, what's her name? The fact that I'm saying what's her name. And I shouldn't be. I know her stand, Spice Girls. I know her stand, but I don't remember her name. I didn't really relate to her too much because she didn't have quite as much autonomy in the series. But at the same time, I'm just kind of expressing that because there's such a diversity in the cast, I feel like that's one of the reasons why it's been so endearing to such a wider audience, because there's someone that people can kind of look at and look to and say, hey, that's cool. That person's got this spot on. Or, nah, man, this is representation, but it's not really accurate. There's just something for you to take a look at. And it's just, I think that's something interesting that I kind of think is just a side note. It's a tangent, but that's a point that I wanted to kind of make in this video. It was important for me to mention it because I think Araki's characters are memorable, and I feel like that's not an accident, and they are memorable in part because unlike a lot of comics, he's not afraid to play with diversity and make them the main cast. Like, it was his goal to do something that was considered quote-unquote bizarre for his culture, and it made the difference. It became iconic. So that's kind of a tangent. It's not really important to the book itself, but it's something that I was kind of thinking while I was putting this script together. So manga in theory and practice talks a lot about what's called the royal road of manga. I did research for this video, but I don't know if that's like an official term for the formula that a lot of Shonen Jump comics follow, but that's how Araki puts it in this book that he wrote. So chapter 1 covers getting started and the importance of writing a page turner. He opens up about his own struggles, and to me it was refreshingly honest how he discussed his failures and what he felt he was doing wrong in like his first attempts to create a manga. Each chapter in this book builds upon the next, a lot like with his manga, but without pulling random things out of fucking Hammer space. I mean, okay, I mean that in the most endearing way possible. I love the insanity of JoJo's, and there's always an explanation. It's never just a coincidence, but sometimes that coincidence feels a little forced. But at any rate, chapter 2 moves into like introducing like the 4 fundamentals of comic structure, which are characters, story, setting, and themes. This is what I meant earlier when I said memorable characters were not an accident. But chapter 2 is more of an overview that's kind of breaking down what he's going to go into detail about, which I think is a smart move because each topic is pretty complex and it deserves its own section, and that's exactly what he does. But before the breakdown, he makes mention that it's wise to check out bestsellers and see what works and to take inspiration. This, as he gets into later, isn't to like copy directly off of others, which, you know, time and time again, artists and writers and people talk about this. And there is a difference between copying and filtering it through your own experience and your own point of view. But this is to like help you understand what readers are looking for in a story. And I think that's good advice. Study from people who have already succeeded and see if you can create something that is going to be similar but is not a copy. I think that's like a problem that we're kind of, this is just a side note, I think that's kind of a problem with where we're at in our pop culture now in the US. We're trying too hard to not take influence from and build upon the nostalgia we love, but instead just reproduce it carte blanche. I think that's a problem because it's not just like the nostalgia that you should be relying on. You should use that as your reference and create your own thing. And I'm not going to talk about Star Wars, but I think that's one of the biggest fucking quote-unquote franchises that suffers from it. But it's not just them. That's just like fucking lowest hanging fruit that I can grab. I want to... Oh, yeah. You take influence from things that have succeeded, but don't get caught up in copying it word for word exact just to capitalize on the nostalgia and the feels of something that was a success previously. Nobody likes a fucking copy. Nobody likes a carbon copy. And each time you carbon copy, every time you put that fucking copy of a copy on the Xerox machine, it gets more and more faded and it's less crisp and it's just a cheap imitation, in my opinion. But this isn't a Star Wars rant, so let's move along to chapter 3 because I'm reviewing Manga in Theory and Practice. Oh god. Chapter 3 covers character creation and poses some very important questions to ask oneself as they start fleshing out their main protagonist and the inhabitants of their story. Araki does reference a lot of manga, most of which I was not familiar with aside from Dragon Ball. But even if you're not familiar with what he's referencing, because they are cultural icons that are found within Japan, and, you know, there's probably people out there not like me who have read this that live in the West. But even though he referenced things that I was not familiar with, it does a great job of helping explain his process while giving pointers on likable protagonists and rules for them specifically if you're trying to write a hero. And by rules, I'll get into this later in the video, but everything he calls a rule is actually a guideline. And of course, he will have a twist at the end of the book. You know he's going to have a twist. And unlike Shyamalan, it's going to be good. I think in most cases, this is pretty sound advice, though, especially since this is regarding shonen manga specifically. Though if you look at shoujo, you'll find many, if not all of them, use some of the same elements. I'll admit, I do think shoujo characters tend to be allowed to reveal more of their emotions. Not to say that shonen characters don't, they definitely do. But man, if you look at Full Metal Alchemist, for instance, that's technically a shonen series. But it had the best character writing I have seen in a long time. And the characters, men and women alike, they cried, they experienced joy. They still kicked fucking ass, as did the women. The male and female characters both in that comic. Kicked fucking ass. But I digress. For the most part, I mean, I think we all know what like a shonen protagonist is like for the most part. And that's kind of like what this book covers and suggests to you. So when discussing characters in depth, Araki stresses that the story really needs to address the character's goals and motivations, and that the story needs to also be interesting to readers. Something that I enjoyed about what he said was that if you can create a truly evil villain, your manga will be more likely to become a classic. This was like kind of like a side note in this chapter, but I think that's pretty spot on. I would not disagree with that. I mean, you think about Disney. What do we know about Disney? A lot of their villains are fucking amazing. Even though I'm jaded on Disney and I'm kind of done with them, done with Disney, I would be remiss to pretend like their villains weren't fucking fantastic. And the same thing for Dio and the villains in JoJo's. Like, I don't want to do any spoilers for people who haven't read, but Dio's pretty well known. There's other fucking villains in there that are just like, wow, they're crazy, but they're enjoyable. Okay, so Araki, as I've been saying, is specifically talking about how to write a popular Shonen Jump manga series, something that is up to their standards. And I think that this can be applicable to other genres as well, but there are times when I don't particularly agree with him, and maybe it could be a mental block on my part. But one thing that he says is that the hero always rises. I think they must rise, but like I've seen in Western comics and films, successful cases where we see the hero downtrodden. Like Batman's a very good example. We have definitely seen Batman in a low spot. We've definitely seen, I hate to keep bringing up fucking Star Wars. You know, the funny thing is Araki liked Carrie better than Star Wars, which I'll talk about later. And I actually kind of, I liked Carrie too. I agree. I kind of agree that film was overlooked. But anyway, wow, this is fucking way off topic. But, you know, to talk about The Empire Strikes Back, all of the fucking heroes are at their lowest. We see them at their lowest. To be fair, I don't see that so much in JoJo's when I watch things. Like, they get put into pickles, the heroes do. But he does stay true to his idea that the hero always rises and there's no backtracking and there's no failure. I think maybe that might be something specific to his target demographic, but I don't personally think that you can't show that in a story. And that's just my personal digression. And maybe I'm just misinterpreting the films where I see the heroes failing before they rise again. I think sometimes, though, you can definitely successfully show a hero fall. And he will go into, like, he does go into that where, like, they don't always have to win, but they have to lose honorably or some shit. Which, I don't mean shit, like, in a bad way. That's just how I talk. I would say, like, specific to this genre of writing, I think he's right. And I do think for the most part, he's right. But I do think, as with anything, there are exceptions. And if you do it well, if you write it well in an empathetic way in which the reader is able to relate and understand and identify, you know, maybe they have been in a similar position where they are their lowest and then they're able to rise from the ashes, I think that can be very successful. And maybe that's not what he's saying, but I mean, that's probably why I should read it again and make sure that, like, I'm understanding things correctly. But if that is what he's saying, I disagree with it. If you want to play it safe, yeah, make sure the hero always rises. But if you know what you're doing, if you think you can do it successfully, I think you can kind of break from that guideline, in my personal opinion. But what do I know? I'm a shit writer, so who am I to fucking talk? You're right. In this chapter, he talks about how the hero always fights alone. And to me, look, I'm all for a fucking hero that, like, is the winner, you know, that always fucking surmounts problems. But I don't think, to quote John Donne, no man is an island. And even within Araki's own writing, you see where the hero has the support of a cast. But, and again, I don't really want to talk about, like, his stories. Like, I don't want to get into, like, Stone Ocean and give any spoilers, but, like, he breaks his own rule where, like, normally you see the hero is the one to defeat the villain head on. Maybe in Stone Ocean, there was a more calculating way in which he's able to explain that the hero is the one who surmounted, even though they weren't the one directly acting, which again, I'm not going to spoil it. Go watch or read it. But to me, I think that's antithetical to like when you've got something where there's like a group of characters who together bring down a villain. You can maybe look at something like the Avengers, any kind of those superhero movies where it's like all of them fighting at once. But I'm just going to go back to Full Metal Alchemist. And again, no spoilers, but that story, the hero is not just Edward. Edward is he is the hero, but so is his brother, Al. And the manga focuses on both of these characters. But again, it's not just them. It's the other cast as well, and everyone kind of works together to bring down the villain of the series. And so I think that, yeah, if you're writing, maybe you want to have the one hero, he's got to always rise, and he's got to be the one, or he or she or they are the one who has to beat the villain. That can definitely be successful, but I think my main problem is just the diction, and that it seems like they always fight alone, with like the cast being supportive. I disagree with that because there are times where, I mean, maybe it's just my fucking union, my union color showing, but like you might need a leader, but the leader is not the one who wins. It's everyone, and everyone contributes. I guess it's just a different, I guess I have like a different system, a value system when I look at my heroes. I am just as happy to see everyone land the blow together than to have like a single person standing out, if that makes sense. But again, I mean, I'm sure that this dude realizes that, and there are of course exceptions to the rules, but this is how you write a successful manga. So, and I'm sure that there are times when you can go outside of that formula, so to speak. Overall, though, I get what he's saying. And I think that this chapter gives valuable insight. Who am I to argue with the greats? Chapter 4 hones in on story. Yeah, this is like super insightful. I mean, and it's not just because I agree with what he's saying, but I tend to agree that readers will pick up on a change in your character's personality if you are constantly making your characters change to suit the story versus having the story suit the character. They're going to feel that something isn't right with the character. I've seen time and time again that people will be angry if a character just does a 180 and is like not really following what they think and have seen the character upholding as their value system. It's also here where he breaks story down into ki, sho, ten, and ketsu. Ki being the intro, sho being development, ten being twist, and ketsu being resolution. He expands upon a couple different combinations that work well. So it doesn't always have to be in exact order, but he kind of gives you an idea of some things that you can do to like kind of shake things up. By the end of the book, he does also demonstrate a time, such as in a one-shot, where you break up some of these guidelines that he set up and explains why he does it. So you set up the rules, you learn the rules, and then you can break the rules. To be clear, this book is supposed to be a guide to teach, inspire, and encourage each comicer to make comics in their own way. He often talks about seeking inspiration, but translating it into one's own vision. And as I was talking about earlier, never copying something exactly. His guide on annoying tropes that pisses him off and makes him stop reading was fucking delightful, y'all. I'm not going to go over all of them, but, most of them I actually agree with. Sometimes you can get away with a few of these tropes if you do it well. That's the key. A trope has become a trope for a reason, but people will just copy off the trope unthinkingly, trying to do something cheap. You know what I'm saying? They're just trying to make a buck, and it's like, you don't feel the passion and it's not clever or new, then you're not going to do it successfully in a satisfying way, in my opinion. If you don't really know what you're doing and you can't do it successfully, then you should probably just avoid them. Although I am also going to say I'm a little bit suspect when he discusses how one shouldn't rely on coincidences. Like, everything in JoJo's is explained, but I can't honestly say that I didn't interpret some of the things to be coincidence. Like, it gets explained, but some of it is a little bit coincidental. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. I guess even if it wasn't a coincidence, he would have been able to talk his way into whatever, but I haven't really caught up on the manga, so I could still be missing some of the story elements. One of the things he discusses is the "it's only a dream" trope. It was only a dream as a trope. It needs to be done very carefully and not as a cop-out. I use dream sequences as foreshadowing, but, I will never use it as a get-out-of-an-ending free card, so to speak. There's a difference between, dream sequences, I feel, and I feel like they work best when they're just, for fun, or, little interesting episodes. Something like Akira Kurosawa's Dreams. That film was very episodic, and it was very interesting. Very, very creepy at parts, but also very stoic. Haunting's a good word, especially for, the tunnel one, and if you haven't seen Dreams by Kurosawa, I definitely suggest it. But that's not at all what Araki is talking about when he's discussing, avoid the "it was only a dream" trope. Y'all know those fucking tropes, and you know how irritating they can be. But I'm just saying that, it can kind of be done okay. As with anything, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, it's been done so many times, and it's really just irritating. And I kind of agree with him on that. I really do. One instance where it would be okay is something like, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, right? That's okay. It's supposed to be weird and wonky and a dream. I will say, if you turn to page 106 and read where Araki instructs, don't have the characters tell you what's going on, and show, don't tell, with a straight face. I just read volume 2, you guys, of Battle Tendencies, and I'm going to flash it up on the screen. Caesar is literally watching JoJo through binoculars and telling Messina what is going on. So, we're seeing the action too, but it's like, bro, dude, man, what in the hell are you talking about? I do agree with him, but if exposition's done well, it's funny. It's part of the fun. So, I don't know. I don't know if he's, too self-aware or if he's not self-aware at all, but he does it well and it works. It's fine. I'm not criticizing it. I think that's part of the fun. But overall, yeah, show don't tell. 100% agree. Okay, let's leave that alone. We're not going to touch that anymore. JoJo's is a joy, and I love the narration and the exposition. Like I said, that's part of the fun. It's like an old radio show. Chapter 5 delves into the importance of art and signification. Being able to identify a character or an artist by their style. This is a really good chapter that I think does a very good job of describing the nuance between having a distinctive style, but knowing how to break the rules. Since, readers may not be able to pinpoint when they see bad anatomy, but even if they can't articulate that something is off, if something is really off, they can tell, usually. Yeah, he discusses that while art doesn't have to be good, if it's not anatomically correct always, say like a stick figure comic or something, that art at the very least needs to be distinctive. So I kind of like that he does go into discussing that, because it is possible to have a comic that's not particularly drawn well, but it's still very enjoyable and it's very distinctive and it stands out. So he goes on to talk about the value and place of realism, while also highlighting the importance of character design and distinctive art. There's a lot of nuance in this chapter, lots of self-reflection on his own art and how his art has evolved over time, and one of his reasons for needing to evolve. This is a really good chapter, especially for people like me who aren't, absolute beginners, but also have a long road to hoe before they get to the level of comic making that they want to be at. One thing also that I wanted to note that I think is an important takeaway from this chapter is how breaks down in diagrams the golden ratio of human anatomies. While I know a lot of this, personally, I think it's always good to like have a refresher to touch base and refresh every now and then. At least I found that to be beneficial for myself. And I've been reminded to keep that in the back of my mind as I've been doing like sketching and planning for other projects that I'm currently working on. It was something that kind of was brought to the forefront of my mind that sometimes, I let slip to the back somewhere when it really needs to be somewhere easily accessible in my mind, if you know what I'm saying. But yeah, if it was helpful for me, I figured that this chapter would probably be helpful for others. So there's so much in this chapter alone that if you don't really think that you'd want to even read the whole book, at the very least, I would recommend this chapter as a standalone. His commentary on analog or traditional medium artists versus digital artists is also kind of interesting to me. Now, I personally see the value in digital art, as does he. But he, such as myself, although I think I'm a little more curious than he is about digital art, but at any rate, I don't think I will ever go fully digital, and this is something that he was discussing in there too. And it's kind of an interesting take on it. I don't necessarily... I kind of agree and I kind of don't, because I do definitely find the value in digital art, and I am just as happy with the print of something that I really like. I don't really necessarily care about something being an individual piece of work and nothing like it in the world. To me, that doesn't necessarily hold any stock with me, but I could understand the concept of something being the only one in the world and being completely unique. But more so what he's discussing in this is like the tangibility of being able to hold the finished page, to be able to look at the work that he's done and physically like run his hands over the ink. Now, he doesn't say that specifically, but I'm just talking from my experience. You can feel the bumps of the ink and the width and the thickness of it. It's a little bit different than like if you get something printed off. So I just found that interesting to think about like in a philosophical manner. But again, I really like digital art too. And he wasn't like shitting on digital art, but I thought it was something interesting that stood out to me when I was reading that chapter. Chapter 6 sets the setting. It covers setting. There's a lot to be said here, but, I'll sum it up in this way. Setting's important for reader immersion, but in most cases, the characters are still supposed to be the primary focus, according to Araki, and so settings should be shown and told via the characters. Obvious exceptions are going to apply, something like Akira, or Blame, or is it Blame? I don't know if they pronounce it Blame or if it's Blame. I say Blame because it looks like the word blame, okay? But anyway, you're able to almost have the setting be a character in a manga like that. And even in those cases, the setting informs the characters and vice versa, and so it's still the characters that we care about most, even though the backgrounds in Akira and in Blame are just phenomenal. I mean, if you haven't seen it, if you just Google and look at the ink work in those pieces, and they're amazing. But in addition to that, you've got the stories and the characters that are just as important. So the scenery doesn't completely steal from the characters, because it's often framed in the sense to demonstrate how, like in Blame, how minuscule the characters are compared to this ever-expanding world that just keeps being built by this artificial intelligence. It's really interesting. I think you should check it out if you like sci-fi. Very, very deeply steeped in the sci-fi setting. But yeah, I'll mention this again here. Araki continually suggests not just reading your favorite manga, but also studying and testing yourself to learn what it is about that comic that you enjoy. Why do you like it? What stands out? What speaks to you? Why and how are you able to relate to it? Don't just consume, analyze, and try to figure out what it is that you like about it. And if you can do that, then you can find a way to translate that into your own storytelling. So chapter 7 is really the kind of chapter that you need to read to understand. It tackles theme and how all elements of your comic should relate back to and connect with its central theme. I've actually watched film critics like there's a dude named Patrick H. Willems, but I've seen other people discuss this also. This isn't like, a secret concept. But the topic regarding trilogies in particular that Patrick H. Willems was talking about on his channel, I think is very insightful because a lot of reasons why he believes trilogies fail unless they are something like The Lord of the Rings, which was actually written as a single book and forced into 3 separate books by the editors. It was written as one thing. It wasn't like thing made and so it was popular, now let's make sequels to these things. It was actually all completed before it even went into publication. That's a little bit different than like, say, Star Wars, where they did a pretty good job with the sequel. I would say the sequel was amazing, but then a lot of people, whereas I really liked Return of the Jedi, like even the people doing the writing, not just Lucas, but like other writers on the project, admitted that they weren't able to kind of explore the other characters as much as they wanted. And so they kind of hit and miss with some parts. Is essentially the thesis of this trilogy film critic's opinion. And I kind of agree with that also. But the point is, theme is something that people often drop the ball on when they're doing trilogies. And that's something that if you're writing a series, doesn't matter if it's a series or a trilogy, you really need to make sure that if you've got a theme that you're sticking with it. This is definitely a chapter that I don't think I can sum up very well in a video. So I am just gonna kind of cop out and say, read it. One thing that I will say, though, about this is that Araki describes his own theme as paean to humanity, which always reminds me of, like, the quote from Shakespeare, "What a piece of work is man." Essentially, he's saying that his themes tend to tie into the strengths of the human spirit, which is literally what stands are. I mean, it's pretty on the nose. But essentially his stories are supposed to be a celebration or a tribute to humanity and its struggle and triumph in the face of adversity. And he strongly impresses that no matter what theme you embrace, you need to stay true to your own vision. Don't just go out there and pick something that's popular that's going to sell, because people are going to be able to tell that it's not something you're passionate about. Pick themes that speak to you and your passions. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say about Chapter 7, because I'm not going to be able to really give you as good of a description. You just really have to read it for yourself. After Chapter 7, he gets into like the examples, which, as I said towards the beginning of the video, the first example is long form storytelling. I did enjoy the examples because Araki doesn't just go over his process for thumbnailing, but more so he discusses like the cerebral part of comic writing, and he stresses to keep an open mind and listen to the views of others because ideas are everywhere and they're immortal, according to him. You know how melodramatic some writers are. But it is true. It is true. Ideas can be found everywhere, and there are no end to ideas, only an end to an artist's interest and curiosity and interest in pursuing ideas. So some good stuff to build up the inspiration can be found in these examples. To kind of specifically delve more deeply into his example, he tackles how he goes about writing a long series. He uses JoJo Lane, I think is how it's pronounced. He uses that, not JoJo Land, but like this specific arc of the story. He uses a chapter in that as an example. And he talks about scripting and how he judges the length of a chapter or an episode based on, how much he's written on a specific lined piece of paper. He goes into like the planning process and how to learn paneling through observation. And that there's like this ebb and flow and this rhythm that your panel should have, and it should be a very smooth eye movement, making it easy for the reader. I think there's a lot of really good commentary and explanation in this part of the book, which is what I like about it, because it's not just a how-to book, but he also gives you the examples of how he implements these concepts that he discusses throughout all the other chapters. There's also the importance of critique that he delves into, and, he's specifically discussing this in context of his editor. I personally do think he has a point in some cases. Not to be like rude, but this and this is not, to me, I didn't read this in a condescending manner, but like the quote that he has in here, this is what he says, is that only children grow through praise. It's the mistakes and the failures that provide hints for where to go next. Again, that sounds condescending, but in the context of what he's talking about, he's not saying that people who don't take critiques are immature. That's not what he's saying. I mean, I've shared my opinions on critiques on this channel before. I don't really need to go into that and reiterate it here in this video. You can check out that video that I did go into like a deep dive about my opinion down in the description. I'll have a link for that. And of course your mileage may vary. Everybody's got a different opinion on critiques. But for me, with this, he explains that, you know, you don't always have to listen to critique. You don't always have to do what the critique says. But if a person has an issue, it may not be what they're saying that is the problem with your comic. It could be that they may not know how to properly articulate or pinpoint what it is that's bothering them, but that something is bothering them, and that the fact that they feel the need to say something is an indicator that there could be something wrong that you're not expressing the way in which you intend, if that makes sense. I know that's a lot of words. I know that seems really kind of nitpicky, but what I'm saying is sometimes you know there's something wrong and you don't know how to articulate that, but you want to express it. And that might be what the reader, or in this case, an editor, does. And it's valuable to know that if somebody is piping up, they care enough to make a comment because they're clearly in some way invested, unless they're a troll. But he doesn't get into trolls in this book. So again, it's not just take critique or you'll never grow. There's like layers to why critique is good to at least think about. He actually expands on this concept in example 2, saying, quote, having your flaws singled out, bracket, by an editor, such as being told that certain aspects of your manga are uninteresting, doesn't feel good, but you have to take the attitude of being grateful for the response. Okay, again, a little bit melodramatic, but you get the drift. The reason being, because as he talks, if the editor doesn't give you feedback, if the editor pulls it out of the envelope and puts it right back in, it's probably an indicator that they've given up on you and are not even going to waste their time reading something that they believe the artist or writer won't be able to improve or will not improve. So when you kind of think of it as in the other person's time, that they're genuinely investing their time into giving you this critique, you can kind of see what he's actually getting at, the crux of the matter. They may be critiquing you, but it's not because they don't care about your work. It's because they see potential and they want to see whatever you're doing come to fruition and be as polished as possible. They don't want to waste their time if they think you're just not going to learn and you're not going to, you're not going to get any better, and it's just going to be something that is unsatisfactory to them. And you can in some ways respect that of a person, in my opinion. But again, this is a different relationship. This isn't just some blowjo on the internet who wants to tear someone down or maybe wants to insert themselves where they aren't necessarily invited. This is the relationship between a writer, an author, an artist, and their editor, or somebody who additionally is invested in your success, if you get what I'm saying. Another kind of interesting point of view he gives is that when you go it alone, and I can attest to this personally, it's really hard to tell that you're going in the right direction. But again, he also stresses don't just take feedback blindly. This, and I'm going to kind of talk about this isn't like in the book, but this is something else that the book made me think about, is that there is this dance that most artists or comicers have to perform with their readers. There's this pull and tug between the two. You know where you want to go, but you also value the intelligence and the time of your readers. It's hard as a writer because readers can't always see where you're going. And so you don't want to spoil, your own story, but also at the same time, what you think is a good idea that you can't spoil may not end up being good or satisfactory in the reader's point of view. So it's also important to kind of, not float on the whims of the crowd, because you can't be a slave to the masses and you really have to be true to your own vision and passion. So, I mean, you kind of see where it's like, it's not so much a catch-22, but you can see how it's a very delicate balance. It's good to have feedback, it's good to listen to feedback, but you're also the type of person, or you need to be the type of person that needs to be able to pick out from the critique what is useful to you and kind of leave behind what's not. It's a very fine line. It's a very fine line to walk. And, for the most part, I personally just wobble on the line and fall off all the time and hold on to it by the seat of my pants, but whatever. I have found that this section in particular was very not therapeutic. It was very cathartic. That's the word. Having someone express in a very nuanced way how I personally feel about the topic of critique, at least as it pertains to myself. To me, this chapter felt this section felt very cathartic. My very last note that I jotted down on this specific topic was, even advice you don't agree with can help you improve. And I think that's very insightful. And if you think about it, you can kind of understand on a deeper level what that means. It doesn't mean just blindly listen to what people tell you need to say or do in your comic, but it is keeping an open enough mind to entertain the idea that, what maybe sounded good to you could be improved by taking in the views of others. Or maybe if people have no idea what they're talking about because they have no idea where you're going to end up, then that you can make the judgment to stick to your guns. It's something that's not at a level that I feel I'm comfortable telling anyone what to do, which is why I got to read this book and talk about it. Anyway, the crux of the example 2 is actually, a template for writing a one-shot. It's the short form storytelling. Araki once more reminds us to use the Kisho Tenketsu as your guide. Again, that's the intro, development, twist, and resolution. He really leads us through this concept using his 45-page one-shot for Thus Spoke Rohan Kashibe, the one-shot Millionaire's Village. If you want to watch that anime version of this one-shot, it is also on Netflix if you have Netflix. I've seen it before. I watched the whole series. I wasn't as interested in Thus Spoke Rohan Kashibe as I am JoJo's, but I wouldn't say that it wasn't enjoyable. Let's put it that way. Since one-shots are consolidated stories, Araki impresses the importance of every scene, every panel, and that you have strong characterization. For this reason, he also suggests limiting characters and having panels, dialogues, and scenes pull double duty, showing the setting, hinting and guiding you through the story, while focusing on the characters and using dialogue with expressions and body language to convey that motivation that was so important when he was discussing characterization and storytelling. Key is the build up to the story proper, where the scene is set as we get our introduction to the characters. Sho is the development where the character begins their journey, and then you've got the 10 where it's often a character reacting to the villain. Then the villain responds, and you've got that back and forth between them until you reach the highest level of tension, that back and forth. That all builds up to the ketsu, or the resolution. One point that Araki makes that I think is key, and is why I myself have been starting to work more on one-shots and shorts than I really have in the past, which I was starting to do without reading this book, obviously with the Comic Fairy zine and other zines that I've participated in, is that series or long-form storytelling is just essentially an extension of short-form storytelling. If you can master the one-shot and practice creating successful short stories, then you can apply the same concepts to a longer story, which is built upon shorter episodes. The conclusion functions as a conclusion, obviously, but I think it really does have some valuable advice and shouldn't be skipped over if you decide you're going to read the book. What I like about Araki is how, in this conclusion, after expressing and sharing step-by-step guides on how to create manga the shonen way for Shonen Jump, he's got one more pen for us. This one path along the road, this is just one way that works for him and can work for others. But he stresses that no one person has an answer to how do you make a manga? And he says flat out, To conclude otherwise is presumptuous and arrogant. I just fucking love that. After he gives you a fucking step-by-step, he turns around and says, this isn't the only way. But to quote him, there need not be only one correct way. And I actually do definitely agree with him. And that's the way I kind of view this book. There's things that I find very valuable, but there's also things that's really not going to apply to how I personally want to write. Some might say that's a bit of a cop-out, but I say that's very reflective in much of how he discusses manga creation. Like, he talks about trying new things and how he successfully went against the tropes of the time to create something really bizarre but fresh. Like, he contradicts much of his own advice, but that's what makes this book, in my opinion, a great guide. Because it forces you to think about the concepts, but also question them, and tells you to embrace the advice of others, but still follow your path. And he concludes that while this will produce a successful manga, it's not the only path to the quote-unquote golden way. Many roads lead to the golden way, in fact, and the advancement of art is a living process. So even the golden way is not like a manual. All of this is just a guide to help you develop your craft. Don't look at it as like a set, strict rule book that you have to follow, boom, boom, boom. Use it as a way to kind of get yourself started or get yourself into it and improve what you're doing and what you're writing and what you're drawing. I think the people that will get the most out of manga in theory and practice are either those of us who have already been working on comics for a while and need some guidance to improve or some inspiration, or people who are new writers who are curious, excited, open-minded, and most of all, very determined. Not wishy-washy, not looking at this as like, it's just a fun hobby. I think that this book is going to benefit people who like literally want to create a popular manga. If you're just doing it for fun or a hobby, yes, there's definitely shit that you can get out of this, and I think it's an enjoyable read, but I really feel that it's definitely more geared towards people who are wanting to get published in Shonen Jump. While I'm sure he realizes a Western audience is going to read this book, I'm pretty sure the people he had in mind were probably aspiring Japanese mangaka. And that isn't to say that there isn't value to be derived from that, but it's a guide for people who literally want to get published. And if you're someone like me, who's an indie artist, I don't really give a shit about appeasing the Shonen Jump demographic, if that makes sense. I do definitely want to improve on my writing and visual storytelling, but I also don't want to, obviously my stuff is rated mature, it's got nudity, it's got a lot of like topics that really aren't focusing on a teenage audience, you know what I'm saying? So while I didn't need his permission to use this book solely as an atlas to get me in the general idea on what direction I should be going, I at the same time appreciate that he'd go to the consideration and, have the foresight to include that little caveat so that people don't get bogged down and fixated on this singular formula. I think that's important, that sometimes people kind of hyper-focus on a step-by-step guide when really you can be a bit more loose with your trip down the royal road or whatever road you want to be walking down when you're making your manga, okay? Your comic. Essentially, it begs you to be creative. It asks you to use it as a guide, but also to add your own thoughts, which is what's so important about storytelling. Why you want to tell someone else's story? Tell your own story. Add your own experiences and expression. It encourages you to look for guidance, but ultimately respects you and your creative abilities. And that's something that I can get behind. Would I recommend this book? Yeah, I mean, I would, but I'm pretty easy to please, y'all. Let's not mince words. There's things that I definitely don't like, but overall, I'm pretty open-minded to stuff, so I would definitely recommend this book. Even the parts that I didn't agree with, which I discuss a little bit in this video, I still think they're valuable. Just because I don't personally find it applicable to myself, and just because I'm a contrarian and I can argue against his points, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's wrong. You know what I'm saying? I'm personally going to purchase a copy of this, maybe a little bit in the future when I've gotten a couple projects done and read a couple other books. I've got like a huge reading list this year. But as always, I would suggest to you, dear viewer, to check it out first. See if it fits your taste before you lay down your hard-earned pay for this. You know, I found it to be valuable, especially since I'm working on a one-shot right now for the Comic Fury Zine Psychedelica themed zine that's coming out this July 2023. I've been doing a ton of research, and this book really provided some valuable insight for me to check against my own work as I start working on this bit by bit. My one-shot's going to be kind of a nonsensical homage to Chris Cool and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, so it's going to be a little bit different than like something that's an ongoing series, but I'm still going to be keeping this stuff in mind as I work on it. Overall, I like the book. The type is a nice size. It's got some good content. I hate saying content, y'all. Its contents are good. The text is awesome. The reading was very smooth. The concept's clear and concise. And there are some actual examples. So, yeah, that's all I got to say about that. Join me next Wednesday for another video if you like. You can support my comic or writing or whatever, my videos. Do all that stuff on Patreon or Subscribestar Adult if you so desire. It's never required, but it's always appreciated. I'm getting out of here. Thank you for sitting through this long video. If you got to the end,